Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can support me on Subscribe Star Locals and buy me a coffee. Today is episode 20 of the political commentary, Trump versus the universities. Once again, joined by Florian. Glad to have you back.
Glad to have you here. Glad to be back.
All right, so let's start by framing the discussion. On the left, what you're going to hear is, this is a war on education. This is a war on the universities. The universities are where you have, tenured professors who, in theory, right, can speak the truth and not get fired. That's why they have tenure. That's the theoretical justification.
Yeah.
And of course, you have a lot of young people, students, who tend to be impressionable and more oriented towards change. And of course, the university is allegedly supposed to be, free and open discussion. Okay, that's the left's argument. The right's argument broadly is that, well, look, Trump is getting rid of the woke and the DEI, and depending on what kind of right wing you are, also anti-Semitism. And so these are the two broad narratives that are at work. But let's look at the actual facts. The main facts are that Trump has been pursuing three basic aims with education. One is to reduce foreign student visas. The other is to crack down on what he considers DEI and anti-Semitism. And so what he does, and then his positive vision, his positive academic program then is the American Academy. Now, the way he enforces compliance is, of course, a lot of these universities have federal funding. So he's going against them with federal funding being withheld. He's invoking, oddly enough, civil rights laws to push against the pro-Palestine, anti-Zionist, what he considers anti-Semitic positions within the university. Now, one, why is this tactically clever? Well, what is the left going to say? We're against civil rights? Right? I mean, that's what they used for the last 30, 40 years, right? So tactically, it's clever on his part to do that, or his team's part. And also, there are some other laws with regards to allocating funds to foreign students that he's invoking, saying that they're in violation of these laws. And so this is the main thrust of what Trump is doing. And so, having sketched out the environment, what I would say is, the first thing on the left, a lot of it's just tough noogies. They use the civil rights law and all this other stuff to completely hammer away at conservatives and men and other groups that were not outside of their, coalition. And now they're upset that it's being used against them. That's I think what the left's objections really boil down to. But from my point of view, I think that I would support the cracking down on DEI, which is a waste. But I'm opposed and concerned about the sort of using this as a mouthpiece for Israel, with the pro-Zionist, anti-Semitism, whatever they want to call it, angle, which I think could be used to silence serious critics of Israel, not just far left kooks. And so for me, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It's like, well, I like the fact that he's going after DEI, but I'm not so happy about the fact that he's going after any critics of Israel through a blanket anti-Semitism charge. So, it's a bit mixed, but I'll hand it over to you now, Florian.
Yeah. Thanks for having me again. Yeah, there are several things that Trump has done, and they adhere with several promises he gave during the campaign trail. So yeah, as you already mentioned, he wanted to reduce foreign visa, crack down on DEI, and using a civil rights framing for that. Now, of course, the left will always argue there's academic freedom and so on, but we have also seen that that the left also uses DEI framing to exclude certain groups and elevate other groups, right? So even there was some articles in Nature and Science magazine, which are basically the biggest magazines you can publish in, as a STEM-based scientist, or they also take political science stuff, but mostly mostly like physics, biology, biochemistry, and so on. And there is basically articles in there how we need to do more to represent minorities and so on, which is troubling to me because having been in STEM myself, there's really no if there's minorities, if they're smart enough, they get taken by a laboratory. So it's not like that they have been excluded. We need to do more for representation, and there are examples of researchers, like white male researchers, not getting any jobs in universities anymore, or you get set on a short list if you apply for professorship, um, and that short list is also controlled by HR departments, and then you don't get on it. I read on Twitter one example, and there are several of those where people were told, "You're a white man. This year, we're not taking any white people into universities. So there's no white people becoming professors. White women, yeah, but white men not." And these things started already when I started to go into science in Germany. There was always like um, there was a talk of the next director of this institute should be a woman. They all want to have a woman as a new director for that institute, and you think, okay, that's fine. You're in the 90s, and you say, okay, well, yeah, if they want to politically make that a political decision, okay, uh, good enough, because you always think there's like other universities where men can go to become director there, and it was very mild, and that was when political correctness just started to rear its ugly head. But now it's like on turbo boost, right? Especially during 21 and 22, that was actually put into action in more cases. I also remember one New York professor. I don't remember who that was, but she works on behavioral studies at Rockefeller Institute, and she brought this notion of a dude wall up, right? So most universities have a wall of founders and famous researchers, and they're usually white male, black and white often. And she said that bothered her, and those white men, they all need to go because it bothered her that there was no woman, let alone woman of color shown or whatever. She was actually a white woman, right? Usually white women that advocate for these social changes. And so these people have basically completely clamped down on university landscape in 2022, 2023. That's gone down a little bit, but it's coming back up here and there, right? So if you look in more detail what you said, so first of all, Trump has used federal funding as leverage, like research dollars, right? So they would cancel federal NIH grants for research that would determine anything transgender. That research was stopped, and I think that fell mostly in Columbia and Harvard. It was as if Trump wanted to statute an example, and I have seen the list. I didn't find it, but I remember didn't find it for now. But I remember from that list that most of the project at Columbia and Harvard were were um, were canceled, or the federal funding was canceled. The projects could still go on, right? Just not with federal funding, and it seemed like a bit like it wasn't applied throughout the board. It was focusing on two universities, Columbia and Harvard, and probably the other universities took note. So that's how it was rolled out. Um, it was argued that those universities were hotbeds of anti-Semitism that falls under Title VI of compliance with the civil rights law. Um, then some funding was restored with like negotiated settlements later on. They also tried to cap indirect costs, like when universities they finance themselves by the grants that um, that researchers get, and these grants pay a lot of overhead, which is used to pay for electricity and lab equipment, and I imagine books and journals for social science research and so on. and the Trump administration ventured to cap those overheads to at 15%, because that was basically a lot of waste, and the universities was basically use those extra funds not to provide infrastructure, but to stack up the HR department with more DEI employees, right? So that was one measure that the Trump administration did. Then, yeah, as you said, civil rights, DEI-related enforcement escalation under Title VI. That's what happened as well. There was actually an executive order on accreditation, which is interesting. Universities need to be accredited to get federal funding, right? So not all you can't just like found a university and then get federal funding. There are lots of these non-accredited universities. They don't get federal money, and so the agencies that control the accreditation process, they are controlled by the federal government as well. So he used that as a leverage as well, which is sort of effective because that really gets to the financial bottom line of universities.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. And you already mentioned the international education immigration pressure points, and there is an idea, and I probably already latched onto that a little bit, that you don't want to use federal funds for funding DEI, right? So basically, rather than abolishing the Department of Education, the Trump administration uses it to form it in its own image, if you will, right? So the DOE, Department of Education, wants to fundamentally reshape the federal role in higher education, right? And this pressure via grants, agency staffing, and regulation. It's actually really interesting if you think about it, because what was reported on was all like, oh, Trump withholds money from Columbia and Harvard. But it actually went much farther, much deeper than that. And when people say or get the impression that the Trump administration doesn't do enough for XYZ topic, there's a lot of things happening under the surface which is not advocated, not advertised, right? So we should also keep that in mind. And yeah, wait, let me see. Trump actually had that all in his campaign talk, right? In 2024, especially there was talk about endowments and financial penalties. So universities also have endowments that are tax-free money for them. And so one movement had the goal to tax the endowment. But I think that's a longer process. And the immediate processes were putting immediate financial pressure on universities, and they have later on negotiated those pressures away a little bit, right? It wasn't like we abolish everything. It was we use smart financial pressure to get them to heel and on our line.
All right. To put some quantify this a little bit, if the freezing or refusal to give federal funding, depending on how you're looking at it, to these institutions, based on what the administration says are pro-Palestinian or issues or DEI. Columbia, it was $40 million. Cornell, $1 billion. Northwestern, $790 million. University of Pennsylvania, $175 million. Brown, $510 million. There's in some of the elite schools, foreign student enrollment has dropped as much as 10%. Now, if we look at Harvard, which is the one that's been sort of most under the gun, so August 7th to 8th, 2025, patent compliance threat. The administration notifies Harvard of failures under the Bayh-Dole Act governing federally funded inventions, threatening government seizure of patents worth hundreds of millions. Harvard had until September the 5th to respond. September the 3rd, court held victory for Harvard. A judge ruled the earlier $2.2 to $2.6 billion funding freeze unlawful, calling it targeted, ideological, motivated assault, infringing on free speech. The ruling barred further freezes and restored grants. September the 17th, 2025, visa ban escalation. Trump banned Harvard from enrolling international students, citing interference in U.S. affairs by overstayers as part of broader visa restrictions. September the 29th, 2025, debarment proceedings initiated after stalled talks on anti-Semitism. The administration pursued debarment, potentially banning Harvard from all federal contracts and putting a $2.2 billion in research money at risk. This followed the judge's block on direct cuts. October 25th, onward, ongoing contract cancellations. The administration canceled $100 million in existing contracts and froze additional grants, escalating from prior actions. Total pulled funding nearly $3 billion by late 2025. January 10th, 6-month entry prohibition. Trump invoked the Immigration and Nationality Act to bar non-citizens from entering the U.S. to study at Harvard for at least 6 months, deeming it an untrustworthy steward of international students. January the 15th to 21st, 2026, broader impacts noted. Reports highlighted Harvard's global ranking drop due to funding battles and visa issues with implications for U.S. research and immigration. The administration convened meetings to brainstorm further measures. So with this level of precision and quantification here, the thing that really just sticks out is complete joke is the federal judge. It's like, so you use Title IX to discriminate against men in college, and now that it's being used against you because the Zionists think you're anti-Semitic and you're going to squawk about that? Give me a break. All the DEI hiring for people that were not as good as the men that were excluded. I mean, the entire system is ideologically motivated, targeted assault of heritage Americans. So this entire thing is just fraudulent. It's a joke. And so, of course, when it's being used against them, when it's being used against the left, all of the tools that they use, well, that's not fair, right? But you see, this is why the left has been winning for all these years, because nobody would use it against them. Now, unfortunately, from my point of view, it is a double-edged sword, because voices that would be critical of Israel on legitimate grounds are likely to get caught up in this. And so, it's complicated. Florian.
Yeah, I agree. One aspect that we haven't talked about, and it's not often talked about. I feel like some people talk about it a lot, and I don't think it's as big of an issue in the public view as the Title VI, anti-Semitism, Zionism stuff, whatever is. Where you say, oh, those are anti-Israel protesters, Palestinian protesters, and we don't want them in our country. And you can be of either opinion about that. But one thing that gets never discussed is the influence of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. So if you reduce foreign visa, you also reduce influence of CCP, right? Because they are sending their people into universities. And sometimes with flimsy degrees and a lot of money behind it, right? So you don't quite know what's going on there. I know I remember from my time in research, there was an entire lab in Princeton that was only Chinese. Now I think there was like one or two Americans in there, like white male Americans, and the rest was just Chinese, and that's totally fine. Except that's like an interesting pattern. When you have like these clusters of Chinese people and Asian people, they seem to like clustering among them, right? There's like one lab, there's a Chinese researcher, they all go there, and that also makes for a bit of an opaque structure, right? I'm saying that because there were several examples of postdocs or PhD students coming back from China, and what do you know? They have a little petri dish of an unknown substance in their backpack, right? In most cases, as a researcher, people in our lab have done that as well from time to time. It's in the responsibility of the researcher. Most of us know you don't do that with unsafe organisms. Well, let me correct. No, I don't think either of us ever did that. For example, I had the opportunity once to go on an inline flight from a Madison, Wisconsin conference back to New York City. And there we had little zebra fish there from another lab, and how to transport them back. And some people said, like, you just put them into an empty perfume bottle and then transport them back in the flight. I was on a visa back then. I would never have done that because much too risky. But all of a sudden, some of like foreign students, they bring in like biological substances, yeah, some are a little bit too naive, but there's a real concern that you have people that are bringing on like dangerous organisms, right? Normally, there are other ways to transport biological organisms. You can send them via mail, or you can transport DNA spotted on filter paper. That's something very innocuous, but like actual cultures. So there were several cases where postdocs from China had brought like weird organisms, like some blight or plant disease in, right? And or it wasn't clear what it was, but the entire lab worked on that particular plant disease. So there's a lot of CCP influence, and stopping foreign visa and that allocation of money to that, that also reduces that influence, and that reduces potential diseases brought into the country, and spies from the Chinese Communist Party. Also, there were some outbreaks of orange blight in Florida and stuff like that, right? These things can completely devastate livestock and plants, and can be a really seriously economic burden. So that is also important stuff that gets a little lost in the discussion about should we spend money on education or not, right? There's adverse foreign actors that use our laws or our regulations to somehow sneak into the country, and that should be stopped as well.
Yeah. So if we look at a breakdown of what Trump's proposal is, the American Academy, accessibility and credit recognition. It would grant credit for prior coursework, enabling over 40 million Americans with some college experience but no degree to complete their education efficiently. Funding model, finance through taxes, fines, or lawsuits against private university endowments, generating billions without adding to federal debt or tax burden. Governance oversight could involve presidential board, existing federal agency, or public-private entity with potential bipartisan involvement for sustainability. Content restrictions explicitly prohibits wokeness, jihadism, or other content deemed anti-American, racially, sexually, politically inappropriate, or ideologically biased, aligning with broader administration efforts to eliminate DEI programs. Goals include debt-free education and accessibility, provide free, high-quality degrees to reduce student debt and make higher education available to all Americans, particularly those with incomplete college credit or working from working-class backgrounds. Competition and cost reduction, compete with existing universities to drive down tuition prices and promote efficiency in the higher education market. Merit-based and patriotic focus, restore merit and hard work by eliminating perceived biases, promoting Western civilization and ensuring content aligns with pro-American values while preparing graduates for federal jobs and contractors. Workforce and economic impact, equip students with skills for the job market, boost workforce participation, and redirect resources from wasteful endowments to benefit broader society. So, I mean, a lot of this is just sort of like corporate ease boilerplate. And it really just says, we want to have an education system that's pro-America and not full of woke anti-American critics. But if we step back and look at the situation, the forces that are behind this education initiative Trump is doing, I think, are three. One is the Zionists, who have, after 10/7/2023, were like, yeah, we just raised an army of anti-Semite woke people. And that was one, right? Now, they don't necessarily have broader alignment with, say, the heritage Americans that are just tired of being blamed for everything, or, say, America First people that just want to have, secure borders and such. But at least in this political moment, the particular enemy they all share, woke, DEI, all of this stuff, right? You can also say what you might call the national security crowd, because one, like you said with the Chinese, right? If you have foreign students coming in who might be from countries that the United States is expecting to fight in the future, not a great idea to be teaching them how to do stuff, because then they'll just use it against you when the war starts, right? So all of these elements are converging. Doesn't necessarily mean they have long-term convergence or long-term alignment, but what it does mean is that they all have their own reasons for opposing the woke, the DEI, and the foreign students. Now, on the next follow-up, of course, is this doesn't really seem like a quote-unquote positive education alternative. It's just trimming the fat, getting rid of what these people believe to be fat. And we'll talk a little bit later in this episode about what the real problems with education are. But I'll hand this back to you, Florian.
Yeah, there's actually an early episode from The Simpsons where Homer's family gets into an exchange program with a student, and they import whereas Bart goes to France, the Simpsons family gets an Albanian exchange student called Adil, and he is there to spy on Homer's nuclear power plant, and it ends with Adil being apprehended by the police, and while he's putting handcuffs into the machine, into the airplane, Homer says, like, "Don't worry, Adil, I'll send you those nuclear power plant blueprints that you asked for." Haha. And that's the first time that I got like put onto that problem, right? So the question that I'm asking myself is whether the anti-woke measures, whether the grant cuts and everything, whether that is permanent or it's just like transient. And I can imagine that universities treat that as just like some transient black clouds on the horizon. They just wait it out, right? So basically, that means you renegotiate your way back to recoup some of that funding, and then you say, yeah, and we will not spend it for pro-Palestine professors, and we'll comply. And then the Trump administration just relaxes the brakes, and then they just rebuild silently, right? On the other hand, yes, some professors didn't get their grants extended. They will have probably left for a different university. Maybe even used it to just go to Canada for good measure, right? So some of the departments have been like more or less permanently thinned out, but thinning out still doesn't mean completely abolished, right? So I think this is a longer process. If like whoever is the next nominee in 2028 isn't Republican, then it may be that all those changes get just like redone. Like you can see in Virginia right now, right? So Virginia has like a huge list of things they have introduced now, and it's very woke again. And they basically undid all that Youngkin as a Republican governor did before, right? So that's something that could also happen on the federal level. Although I think the changes are a little bit more complex, that it's not like on the state level you can probably more easily redo any damage that has been done, but on the federal level maybe not so easily. But we may well see a situation where some universities are abolishing DEI, other universities are getting DEI back, and so on. I also wonder, and that's a more of an economic point, not so much political point, but it's worth mentioning that some universities have sprung up in like over the last 10 years, where the students don't pay tuition right away, but they only pay the university back once they get a job. Like they pay like 10% of their future income, which is a good model because it forces the university to not only give them useful classes, but also make sure that they get a job afterwards. So that model has not been talked about for a longer while. So I don't know how their structural changes are coming along. So that's something that the Trump administration might want to pick up sooner rather than later.
Right. Okay. So given the sort of, we've sketched out these two education models, right? Let's call Trump's the lean, mean, pro-American one, right? And then you've got like the bloated DEI woke. The problem is, one, from an energy system perspective, yeah, the woke one is just too expensive. It doesn't work, and it doesn't yield results. So, in that regard, the energy is going to dictate that the government shuts this stuff down. But the real issue, is that we don't have an education system in this country. Okay, so let's look at The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom. He wrote the book he published the book in 1987 in order to bring awareness to the fact that critical thinking, okay, which is the ability to think for yourself, right, teaching you how to think, not what to think, was being undermined. and in fact, in our day, it's completely gone, by the ancestors of the woke, these leftist fanatics in the 60s that just took over through essentially a hostile takeover of direct action these universities. And as Bloom points out, the professors in the 60s and 70s were more or less powerless to resist them, and nobody stopped them. They just took over while the rest of the country was asleep. And so what ends up happening? Well, let's go back to Harvard, right? Because that's where Trump has been putting a lot of his effort in. Up until the 60s, it was required that every student in Harvard take a, not just for specific philosophy courses, but any graduate from Harvard take logic courses to learn how to think. Okay, that was just from Harvard day one until the 1960s. And then all of a sudden, there was, incompetence took over and said, no, one of the most, the prestigious university in the land is not going to teach critical thinking anymore, logic, to any of its students, unless they choose to take it in a course. And of course, they don't encourage you to take it. It's not like, oh, it's a choice, but we're strongly encouraging it, like, say, other things. So we actually don't have an education problem. The woke is just clearly the worst expression of this. They're the descendants of the leftist fanatics that took over in the 60s, who just completely dismantled the entire apparatus. But I don't really see Trump's alternative or broadly speaking, the right's alternative as any better, because what the right's alternative ultimately boils down to is defund education, privatize it, make it competitive. But that just creates a different set of problems, right? Rather than political correctness and these fanatics dictating terms in universities, you're going to have corporate money. And it's like, well, if this corporation gives you all a whole bunch of new computers, there's certain things you can't teach, certain things you can't say. I mean, that's just how it works. And is it in the interest of corporations to have people have critical thinking skills? Absolutely not. Because then then the entire manipulation of the id by ads to buy products you don't need doesn't work. Right? And a population that is educated and knows how to reason and think will look at an ad and a picture and say, well, wait a minute. If I buy this product, will it really give me the results that the ad says? Will it make me happy? No. They'll realize it's a blind, it's a dodge. And so both sides have reasons other than education in mind that will in fact govern what is taught in curriculum. So modestly, I can say that I'm glad Trump is rolling back all this slop, rolling back the woke, rolling back this, but ultimately it doesn't solve the problem. And of course, if you make these institutions solvent, they might be able to keep running a little bit longer. But again, that doesn't solve the problem. The problem is that they're not doing what they're supposed to do. What they're supposed to do is teach people how to think, and they're not teaching them how to think. And of course, as Bill Lynn said, they're Ivy covered North Koreas. You don't have free speech. You try to say things that are politically incorrect or outside the Overton window, and you're toast. But I think that would be the case. And let's use another example. Instead of a quote leftist university, let's use a conservative one, Hillsdale. There's a lot of stuff you can't say at Hillsdale, right? Say anything bad about Lincoln being a tyrant or Churchill making mistakes in World War II, or maybe rethinking the entire Anglo-American establishment and its mucking around in Europe for the last century. Not going to work. They'll come down on you just as hard. We're seeing this now with the Zionist laws, cracking down on quote jihadism. They'll do it to you too. So it's better, but it's not good. And really, neither group has a fully orbed and developed, robust educational system model.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring that up with logic. It would be so important for contemporaneous political discussions, right? But the old liberal arts college is basically kind of dead, right? So basically, where they would actually, it's not that. There's like one college like St. Aquinas College or something like that, something with Aquinas, and they have a very rigorous and very strict schedule that's basically based on I think on Latin and Greek and history and logic as well and so on. and has a strong curriculum in that direction. Otherwise, from my own experience helping students in academia, the number of logic classes that students needed help with is maybe 5% of all classes I did. And I can guarantee you, if there was a logic class, they would farm, or they would basically ask our help with those logic classes. I mean, that's really something that's not as easy. Um, and actually, also, I found one like document with arguments for for in favor of or against abortion. This is just one example of a useful discussion base that you can use for political discussions in society. And there's like one of these things. I would expect you find more of these argument collections, stuff like that. But you don't. You find like logic is very scarcely, and it actually started a little bit earlier also, like in the 1960s. I recently had a discussion with a more left wing red person, let's say like that, and they told me they had like the arguments was, oh, Donald Trump's a dummy, and I said, maybe we can do a real discussion here, not go to ad hominems. And he said, oh, it's not an ad hominem. I said, yeah, it's an ad hominem. You attack the person, not not their policies. No, ad hominem is always if I attack you. No, that's quite not true. You're not attacking me in a discussion anyway. We're debating a certain point, right? We're debating a certain position. And if you use personal insults, you don't need to insult me. You can use these personal insults against the subject of your discussion, and then we can't discuss it anymore. And basics like that are just gone. I mean, people don't even know how to discuss, and that started earlier. It started, unfortunately, in my generation, apparently as well, right? So this is something that needs that would be a true benefit, but these things kind of go under, and also I think they're not really strongly pursued in our hyper polarized atmosphere. There was Richard Dreyfuss, the actor Richard Dreyfuss, had like something the Citizen Initiative or something like that. He wanted to bring back how do you call it? He wanted to bring back knowledge of American civics to the people, and that somehow kind of like fizzled out. It wasn't like a big thing on Twitter or on the news or anywhere else. Maybe he talked about it for 2 or 3 interviews, and that was it, right? So part of the absence of logic, part of the absence of important groundwork in terms of education is also due to our hyperpolarized environment. But maybe, as you said, when in the 60s, the left kind of like abolished the requirement of logic, all that, maybe it's time now for the right to reintroduce those requirements under the radar as well, right? And all of a sudden, in 10 years, everyone can now discuss logically coherent again. You know?
Well, it is definitely more likely to come from the right than the left. The left has just taken this like anti-reason, anti-life stance. Now, there are 2 crises that the university, properly ordered, is very well equipped to solve. Okay, first of all, we have a crisis in science and technology, in STEM, right? We also, so for example, Michio Kaku, I remember watching sometime like the last 15 years, I don't remember when, said that, what keeps a lot of American science going is the foreign students coming in, because you don't have the domestic ones coming in. I'm like, yeah, that's because millennial men and Zoomer men got attacked by Title IX. Duh. Like, that's why you didn't get them in there, because they were being blocked. But, okay, forget about that, right? And these foreigners, that's what was keeping it going. He was, pro-green card moment. Okay, what's your precondition for science? All science. Logic. Literally, by definition, if you can't think logically, you can't do science. Done. That's it. It's done. So why are we running a high-tech, high-technology society, and we expect, we encourage, we don't just not teach people logic, we encourage them to be stupid. We give them every opportunity to indulge in the most irrational and animal appetites and act out the most, inappropriate behavior, and we don't teach them to think. So one, who does it hurt the most? People from lower incomes, poor people, because guess what? They have smaller margins. And so The key to getting ahead in life is planning a life trajectory. And if you can't think and you can't reason, newsflash, you can't plan a life trajectory. And also, this fundamentally undercuts science. So, as Michio Kaku said, most of the people that are keeping this going are foreigners, right? Because we're not investing in our own people. China is. China's doing quite good. They do very good at this, math and science stuff. The other thing is civic public engagement in political life, right? That's where the liberal arts came in, right? The founding fathers understood that man is not born competent to engage in political activity. Okay, it is a part of you can see the interplay between history and politics when you read the Federalist Papers, which basically is an analysis of historical republics, how they were successful, how they failed, and how the United States could construct a constitution that would hedge against everything that we had seen up to this point. Of course, you have to know how to do that. And by civics, what I don't just mean what, say, a right-wing American might mean is, basic knowledge of our government, basic knowledge of our history, which, of course, you should have, but a deep, broad knowledge of the history of Europe, where all of these institutions were forged and how these governments could come together and fall apart, and learn from that. And of course, people, it's not innate. You're not born with this knowledge. You have to be educated to have this knowledge. Of course, that's gone too. Go back and read Closing the American Mind by Alan Bloom. These fanatics took over and got rid of the two pillars that kept our country going. They got rid of logic, so there goes STEM and science, bye-bye. And then they got rid of the liberal arts. Well, there goes civil life, bye-bye. And look at where we're at now. A total dumpster fire. Now, that's what the university and more broadly all education in America should be aiming at. It's not. Now, does Trump get us closer to that? Yes. Does he get us where we need to be? No. Florian.
It's a good point that you pointed out that lots of foreign students come to the U.S. I feel like in the 90s in Germany, the notion was that the U.S. needs, it was a teacher told me, the U.S. needs to, people in the U.S. aren't smart enough, so they need to get more foreigners in because foreigners are then bringing the smarts into the U.S. That really was an opinion in Germany and probably also across Europe. Well, although maybe only in Germany, but you can see from that point how maybe the transatlanticist class, maybe they found it very easy to get rid of white people because they branded them as stupid and dumb. Hence, I shouldn't have even mentioned it, but I did. The Simpsons, for example, Family Guy, and once again, you don't realize that in the 90s. Look back at it, yeah. I mean, this is propaganda that makes the American white man look stupid, right? And then you think, oh, they're dumb. They need foreigners to survive as a country because Americans they're just like idiots, right? And so this notion, this spiritual notion, has been widespread all around, like the liberal European transatlantic faction, and that's one reason that actually the overall system has been dumbed down to just adhere to one specific political directory, right? There was nobody who questioned the assumptions of the transatlanticists. They just thought that's the way it should be, and then you have heavy managerialism, and that's also not really improving the knowledge of universities. You have a lot of managers there, a lot of HR specialists, but they don't really make education better. It gets down to dumpster fire. And as you mentioned, then you can probably also think about corporations wanting to have not knowledgeable people, but mostly people that are a little bit dumbed down from university, so they can basically teach them, or they can use them more easily as a cog in the wheel for machines, for their corporate machinery, right? So that's one thing that also takes place, and I'm actually not sure whether we can solve the problem of education on the long run. It probably will have to go through true liberal arts colleges like Thomas Aquinas College and other universities that kind of like develop their own ethos, their own that also attracts people, right? Right. Where if you see there's all like social science slop being taught at universities, then more people will say, well, let us go to something that's more interesting. And if these colleges that teach logic and ancient history and like a deeper dive on civics, if those colleges manage to actually get those people tangible jobs afterwards, then I see how these universities can actually come back and basically blunt the impact of social science a little bit.
Right. So I think what we're going to end with is a response to, I think, a very interesting question from Brandon Flatman. What's your opinion on AI taking academic jobs? My dad was a programmer for decades, and now he can't get work. Will there be any point in going to university/college in the future? Okay, so when it comes to the university itself, that is amazing. I am so behind this because here's the thing: we can talk about all the pros and cons of a computer algorithm, of an AI, but I am just so sick and tired of all these woke, leftist, liberal fanatics that have been destroying the university for the last 80 years. Now, I don't think Grok or ChatGPT is going to do that. I'm not even saying they would be the ones running it, but I'm just saying if you did, I don't think it would. What you could do then is most of the university staff is, of course, going to be support. And you can just get rid of that because a computer does it. You can really streamline how many people on staff you actually have to do teaching. And furthermore, those teachers can then offload the procedural stuff onto the AI, right? So what you can do is you can get rid of HR, you can get rid of the bureaucracy, and then you can just have a handful of people that actually need to be there to do the work. But now there's still a broader problem here, which is the brick and mortar institutions themselves. They're dinosaurs. We live in this digital age. What you should have is a distributed network of educators who the core distribution mechanism is online. We've already seen online classes. I mean, one of the earliest examples was Khan Academy. You could go learn a lot just from him. There's no reason why, say, a Harvard class on medieval Europe couldn't just be open source on the internet for anybody to watch. And if you watch it and you pass and then you just take the test, well, you pass the test, you've got it. Okay, you can just do this in your spare time after work. It doesn't matter, right? You've watched all the course material, you've then taken the tests, and then you will then some sort of if you want to have some sort of you pass the test. So that means you have done it. Therefore, you will be accredited for that. And you can just do that on a la carte or whatever basis. Do whatever you want, right? Cafeteria basis. And then second of all, if you were to just, have the most premium level of Grok and just spend all day asking it questions about history, you would learn a lot very fast. It would be far better than going to any single professor at a university. And in fact, they could probably answer questions that person couldn't. And I would argue now, okay, there's what the AI is trained on. So of course somebody could say, well, there's bias in the people programming it. Yes, of course there is. But here's the thing: once you programmed it, there's no extra bias. You go into a university with a leftist professor, the bias never stops. So yeah, there's always, as long as humans are training the AI, there's always going to be the bias of the programmer. Okay, fine. But that's going to be infinitesimally small compared to the bias of a 10-year university professor who teaches, say, critical theory, right? I mean, this is not even close. It's not even close. And so ultimately, education could be very cheap, and education could be brought within the hands of everybody with a smartphone. It would take effort. It would be, a serious effort by the nation, all hands on deck, but you could do it. And of course, what that would do is it would break the monopoly of the institutions of higher education. No, I'm not saying you shouldn't have any. There's obviously reasons to meet in persons and groups. But they wouldn't have this sort of, they would more be a place to meet and present and cross-pollinate rather than just this gatekeeping monopoly that keeps us all stupid. So yeah, Florian.
Yeah, first of all, sorry to hear, Brandon, that your dad can't get work. There are studies that say that actually what happened with AI, what's happening right now, is that the senior management is basically eliminating the junior management. Now, when you say that your dad was a programmer for decades and now he can't get work, that would argue a little bit against that, right? So maybe AI is also used to get rid of senior programming. I think to go forward with education, I agree with Todd. Lots of things will be like outsourced by universities to AI. And now you can say some students, they learn better in person with a teacher. Well, that will be solved soon as well, because you can use robots to do that, right? You already have Android robots. They can walk around, look normal. You put a skin on them, and they can be your teacher. And I guarantee you, for many people, that will be good enough as compared to a normal. People already use AI on their phone for companionship. That also, like, people use ChatGPT to talk about their personal problems, and then they get a soothing voice tells them that everything is good. That's an entirely other ethical problem here. But I think what universities still need to teach, what AI can't take over. And when you're right, there's maybe not a point in going to university college in the future for STEM or for programming or stuff like that. But you need to teach people how to sell. You need to teach people how to deal with finances. You need to teach people how to argue with logic and so on. So there are some things that AI cannot completely take over yet. And so for that, you will still need university education, but it will be radically different from what we have now. And there may even be a temporary renaissance of social science jobs, because AI has the strongest impact on STEM jobs, right? So then they go back, and then social sciences may get a temporary upswing and be less affected, and you may have actually better job prospects in the future. Also, given that you need to have language specialists that teach the AI, right? It says that, LLMs, large language models, are just like their own language. So linguists could work there as well. But I think on the long run, it will be similar to what Todd said. You don't need universities anymore, but I would say you probably need places where they teach people more practical skills. Instead of writing something, instead of programming, you will teach people how to not only program an app, but also how to sell and market it. For example, right? That could be some way in which universities are different in the future.
All right. Well, thanks again, Florian. Always a pleasure having you on.
Thanks, Mac. Thanks for having me.
This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.